So, hello friends, welcome once again in continuation of the web series that we organized through our virtual V4 channel. We have our distinguished guest today, Professor Nitin Patil from Pratap College, Amarne. In the morning, he had delivered his lecture on our world in the time of pandemic. Its second lecture is titled Building Bridges, Humanities and the Pandemic. So I welcome once again Professor Nitin Patil and invite you to just deliver your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi, once again for the invitation to deliver a couple of talks in this series. I hope the purpose behind organizing this series is to create awareness amongst people regarding this pandemic and the ramifications of this pandemic upon our society and upon our world. So when I was asked to give a couple of lectures, I deliberately chose two topics which are interrelated. So in the morning, as Dr. Joshi has already reminded us, that I spoke on a topic titled Our World in the Time of Pandemic. So in that talk, what I did was I talked about what are the social, political, cultural, geopolitical impacts of this pandemic upon our world. And so in this lecture today, in this second lecture, which is in continuation, which is a kind of sequel to the first lecture, I'm going to talk about building bridges, humanities, and the pandemic. As I said in the first lecture that I am a humanities teacher. By the term humanities teacher, I mean we are teachers who teach literature, philosophy, social sciences. We are regarded as the humanities teacher. So what I'm going to talk about is what is the role of humanities in the time of pandemic, and the kind of problems which I outlined in my previous lecture as to what this pandemic has done to our world and what kind of world it is going to create. So what role humanities have in building bridges between communities, building bridges between activists, building bridges, let us say, in the human collectivities, so that we can create a better world, a world which is more equitable and a world which is more just. Before I actually begin with this talk, I'd like to narrate a couple of stories, shorts, little anecdotes, I should say. Both of them are actually not apocryphal, but the real, anecdotes. So the first anecdote is related to a man called Primo Levi. Primo Levi, as we all know, was a very famous chemist. And he was a Jew. He was arrested by the Nazis during Second World War and during Hitler's period, and he was put into concentration camp. Fortunately for Primo Levi, he survived that concentration camp, and at the when the war was over, he was released from the concentration camp by the Allied forces. And when he came out, we all know Holocaust and the reality of concentration camp. It was one of the most horrible crimes which humanity has ever seen, where millions and millions of people were simply butchered by the Nazis. And when he came out, people asked him a very interesting question. The question which was asked to Mr. Primo Levi was because the person who was asking the question thought that only demons are capable of this kind of atrocities. And that's why he asked Mr. Levi, what were those monsters in the concentration camp were like? And Levi answered in a very interesting way. And I hope we all understand this response which Levi gave. And Primo Levi said that apart from a couple of real monsters, they were just like, they were common human beings, just like you and me, but badly reared. Please understand this particular sentence. Once I'll repeat it once again for us. He said that apart from a couple of real monsters, they were normal human beings just like you and me, but badly reared. This is first anecdote, and then the second anecdote, and then when I when I complete my argument, I will once again come back to these two stories. The second story is once again related to Holocaust and its aftermath. I am talking about Holocaust a lot because it has been one of the worst experiences the humanity has ever had in the last century. And so the second incident is also about the man who was behind, one of the major architects of Holocaust, the man who came up with the concept of the final solution to the Jew question. His name was Eichmann, a German bureaucrat, a German who was very close to Hitler. Eichmann was responsible. He was instrumental in bringing out the idea of concentration camp, and he played a very active role in butchering millions and millions of Jews. When the war ended, Eichmann and likes of him, they ran away from Germany and they sought asylum under fictitious entities in different societies. But the new Jew state, that is Israel, was hell-bent on bringing these monsters to justice. And as a result of that, Eichmann was apprehended and he was brought to Jerusalem, and a trial was conducted. Now, this was a very well covered trial where, journalists all over the world actually went to see the proceedings of that trial court. And the New Yorker, that famous magazine from America, sent Hannah Arendt, one of the most brilliant philosophers of the last century, to cover that particular trial for the New Yorker. And whatever articles she wrote, those articles later on became a book. And the title of that book is Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil. And in that book, Arendt makes a very interesting observation, and she says that when I went to cover the trial of the Eichmann trial, I thought that Eichmann would be a real monster, a very dangerous kind of a person, but he was just, he was an ordinary human being like you and me. And so she concludes that the evil which made the Nazis to carry out this kind of mass murder, the evil is pretty banal. The subtitle of that book is The Banality of Evil. So this evil is pretty much present everywhere, in the garb of so many ideologies. So these are the two stories I wanted to tell you. Now, these stories are not in isolation. I'll come back to these stories and the importance of these stories when I make my argument. In my previous lecture, what I said, I painted a very bleak picture. I said that, this pandemic has rendered us a very vulnerable, let us say, collectivity. We are without leaders in the true sense of the term. We are without institutions and things like that. And the kind of world which will be there after this pandemic is over will be, if I could repeat myself, would be a meaner and smaller world. And I hope by meaner, I am quite clear what I want to say. A meaner world would be a world which is very conservative, which will not be open to other societies. Societies will remain close to one another. There will not be any mutual give and take. It won't be the business as usual. And when I say smaller world, by that term, I mean, when the globalization started, there was a ray of hope. We had thought in the 90s that the forces of globalization, globalization in the real sense of the term, was thought to be a redistributive force where, the Cold War was just over, and we thought that the wealth of the world will circulate around the globe. The technology which had become the monopoly of certain powers will truly get globalized. So globalization was that kind of a phenomenon. We had expected it to be that kind of a phenomenon, but unfortunately, 2008 subprime crisis and this pandemic has actually taken away that potential from globalization. I mean, uh, there was a great deal of talk of deglobalization after 2008 subprime crisis. But we are still a globalized world. But after this particular pandemic, the problem would be that societies will remain suspicious of one another. Societies will remain close to one another, and that is a big problem. I mean, and when I said that, the global institutions have failed. In my previous lecture, I did talk about what it took for these institutions to come up and how these institutions have failed us. Now, just a simple thing, I would like to tell you that, if you go to the United Nations building in New York, in one of the meeting rooms, there is a poem which is, put up on the wall. And this poem actually talks about, it justifies the rationale of this kind of institutions. This poem is from Sadi, that 13th century Iranian poet, where he actually, in one of the lines, he says that we all human beings are actually organs of one another. Consider a human body. If your arm gets hit, the entire body will feel the pain, right? In the same way, these institutions came up because they thought that the entire humanity is one collectivity, regardless of race, gender, color, nationalities, and everything. And whatever one feels, whatever a particular group of that community feels, the other party will feel the pain of it. That was the purpose, that was the rationale behind creating these institutions. And unfortunately, as we are witnessing in this time of pandemic, all these great institutions are almost rendered useless. Now, what I want you people to understand is that there are greater forces which are at work, and these forces have made our world like this. Now, this pandemic is actually, I'll call it I will call it as a rupture, it's a break. And every rupture is actually a repetition. It is a disavowal of what has gone by. So now this particular point in time, we need to think of creating a better world, a world which is sensitive to one another, a world which will be more equitable, a world which will be more just. So now, what exactly are the forces which which are not allowing us to make this, or which are not making us realize these dreams of internationalism, globalization, and democracy? Now, the problem with human race is that we take words very lightly. When Abraham Lincoln defined democracy in that brilliant way, that it is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Now, this of the people, by the people, for the people was a very great leap forward. You remember the famous words of Neil Armstrong and Aldrin Aldrin when they stepped on the moon. He famously said that a small step for a particular individual, but it is a giant leap forward for the entire human race. I mean, when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, it was an individual taking that step, but that event actually marked that great progress this human race had made. So that is what he meant by it. So basically, we all human beings, need to think of a collectivity. There will be forces which will keep us apart, but then we all have to overcome these forces. So what exactly? Remember, so what are these forces which stop us? What are these forces which do not allow us to realize that, let us say, that promised land, if I could use that phrase from the Bible, the promised land, devoid of all the theological content of that term. To my mind, there are certain forces, certain global forces which make this, this dream unrealizable. And in my lecture, in the previous lecture, I did talk about a couple of these forces. So I believe that, genocidal nationalisms, then neoliberal economic policies, and remember, and I'm going to use a slightly technical term, called long durée structures. Now long durée is a French word which comes from Annales School of History, Fernand Braudel and company. What they meant by this particular term was that when a particular society takes roots and grows, it in the process certain changes do take place, and these changes take place over a long period of time, and these changes actually affect, or let us say influence, so many our future outcomes which that society is supposed to produce. Those are called as long durée structures. So please remember, these are the three things which I'm talking about. Now I quickly move on to my next point, and I would say that this crisis, as I was talking about the concept of crisis in the morning, I said that every crisis is an opportunity. I mean, this is has now become a cliche that every crisis is an opportunity. In what sense every crisis is an opportunity? I believe, why does a crisis take place? A crisis takes place because the older model on which we are based, we find that that particular model is not working anymore. So that becomes a crisis, and so that crisis is an opportunity to look at, to revisit, that model, and whatever good is there in that model, carry it forward, and whatever is not workable with that model, let us abandon it and create some, supplement that model with something, so that our dreams realize. So every crisis actually demands two kinds of responses. Please remember this. And the first sort of responses is a short-term response, and the other kinds of responses which I am talking about, or kind of solution I am talking about, is a long-term solution. Now, what do I mean by this short-term, long-term solutions? Now, I'll give a very simple example. This was something which I learned from my great teacher, Professor Zavre, and he illustrated this point in a very simple way. Suppose, there is a woman in the bus, because patriarchy is still a reality in our society. If a woman comes across some kind of gender injustice, then that lady should fight back. That is the short-term response. So fight against sexism, because she is the subject of that injustice, because on a greater levels there's sexism everywhere in the world. But in short term, she is fighting back, immediately fighting back. But in longer terms, we need to attain to the creation of mindset. For example, creating such a mindset which will be free of patriarchal values, so that automatically gender problems from our society are solved. But this kind of solution, this kind of mind change, will not be achieved in, let us say, a ziffy. It will take generations and generations of work. So the short-term responses is fight back against all kinds of problems, and long-term response is actually create a mindset devoid of those problems, so that you will be able to create a better world. So that is the kind of thing. So now this COVID crisis, what are the problems it has created? It is going to create a smaller, meaner world, as I said. It has given rise to shallow nationalisms, as I have already pointed out. It has created, a kind of world which is, look at the kind of solutions which are provided. They are very class fixed solutions. Now, what do I mean by class fixed solution? Class fixed solutions means, you are just taking into account the middle class and upper middle class and super rich class. What about that particular, the largest sector of electorate, which are part of your polity, but they are just off the radar of almost all the governments in the world. So, so these are the problems which COVID-19 and that pandemic has created, and this is the kind of world which it has created. So now, when I look at this crisis, I believe that there are two kinds of responses which we can think of: quick fix solutions and then the long-term solutions. Now, why am I emphasizing the role of long-term solutions? Remember that famous thing, 1947, we became independent. We had wonderful leaders, we had wonderful generations, but India has not realized all of its dreams. So has almost all the nations in the world. So what is it that stops us from realizing our dreams? What is it that stops us from realizing, that, remember that famous sentence from John Steinbeck's wonderful novel, The Grapes of Wrath. Remember that novel even also even talks about a particular calamity. It's a novel about that great depression, and the problem, the plight of the farmers during the Great Depression in the 1930s in the United States of America. And there the narrator says something very important. The narrator says that human beings have created new fruits of development in the world, but they have not been able to create a system whereby their fruits can be enjoyed by them. So remember, we have thought of politically and theoretically some wonderful stuff: human rights, democracy, power to the people, government of the people, equality, liberty, fraternity. But we really need to ask this question to ourselves, that have we been really able to realize all these dreams? We all talk the talk, but we never walk the talk. That's the point. So so this bridging this difference between walking and, say, let us say, talking the talk and walking the talk is something which we really need to take into account. Now, when I in 1789, when the French Revolution broke out, this was the revolution which was fought on the principles of liberty, fraternity, and equality. And then what happened after the revolution? After the revolution, a military commander took over the power. There was chaos everywhere, and France, which was supposed to be a republic, became a kind of shallow republic where almost a monarch was ruling over it. A kind of monarchy came back. And while talking about that particular situation, a very famous German philosopher, Schiller, he, in one of his famous letters wrote that a great moment found small men. Great moment found small men. It means that theoretically our forefathers or the great thinkers, they have created a kind, they've created that kind of political awareness. They try to better this world, but we human agents are not up to it. And that is why Schiller says something very important. He says that is why there is a need of aesthetic education. Now, what does he mean by aesthetic education? Aesthetic education means that when you train the imagination of people. Now, what is it? Training of imagination. Training of imagination means, philosophically, we all know that there is an object and there is a knower. The knower knows the object, creates knowledge about that. That's the simple formula. But when you train your imagination in a particular way, you try to look at that object of knowledge in a very different way, and that is why your knowledge will be of different kind altogether. So now, what kind of education does this job? What are the subjects? What are the disciplines which train the imagination of human beings? So I believe that humanities, philosophy, literature, and imaginative social sciences, these are the subjects which actually train the imagination of generations to come. And that is what I was talking about, the long-term effect or the long-term solution to the problems. If at all we have to create an equitable and just world, we will have to create, and then this is something which will never be get done. You will have to keep doing this work again and again and again, because every generation is born with the effect of greed, fear, and violence. As I keep telling, these are the three basic fundamental emotions, human emotions: greed, fear, and violence. All our problems have to do with this. I mean, capitalism, greed, narrow nationalisms, and racisms, casteisms. You have fear, and then as a result of that, violence is perpetrated. That is the kind of world which we have created. So that is why humanities education is such an important thing, because this education will train the imagination of people, and thereby we will be able to create a will to social justice. Social justice is not a concept which is easily understood. Democracy is not about me. Democracy is about us. Democracy is not about, I should say, justified self-interest. It's about will to social justice. You may be of a particular type of a citizen, and you may think, I want this and I want that for me, and because on this ground I want it. These are justified self-interest. But equality for everybody, that is the role of democracy, which we have to take into account. And please remember that famous interview which Dr. Ambedkar gave in 1953. A clip of that interview is doing rounds. It is easily available on YouTube as well. When he was asked that interesting question by that journalist, that Mr. Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar, do you think that democracy will survive in India? Dr. Ambedkar doesn't even think for a second and says that no, it won't survive. And then the person who's taking the interview is shocked, because everybody would be shocked. Here is a man who fought for democracy all his life. Here is a man who wrote this beautiful constitution, this great constitution of this country, and he says that democracy will not last. And then Ambedkar says that as long as democracy does not get transformed, and he says that 5-year elections will take place, leaders will keep changing, but as long as that philosophy of democracy, as long as the political democracy does not get translated into social democracy, this kind of a model is going to have its own problem. So now, failure of leadership, failure of institutions, smaller and meaner world, these are the challenges this pandemic has created before us. So now, how to deal with these problems? I mean, some people may find that this is a bold talk, as if I am modern day Aristotle and giving solutions to the problems which are greater, so great in magnitude. But then there is no harm. I mean, we are all dreamers, and we need to be dreamers. So, and we need to engage ourselves with these kind of problems which we find every day. So what I think is that we also need to think about the short term and the long term solutions. To my mind, the short-term solutions for this problem, COVID, would be, conscience raising or activism. Now, you create an awareness amongst people, create awareness. I mean, because we still don't have the cure for this particular problem. Human behavior is the only solution we have. Human behavior, as if mask yourself, maintain a particular kind of physical distancing, and certain kind of hygienic habits, certain social behavior. That is what is expected. So as long as there is no cure, we will have to think about this kind of short-term solutions to this problem. So what I can think of right now is, we have to raise, create consciousness about this kind of a thing, so that certain kind of activism can be inculcated in the society. So that is what I think. Secondly, digital activism is more important, because we are physically isolated from one another right now. And that is why the one thing which is connecting us right now is digital. But do remember, see, I mean, technology or any other thing is just a tool. Everything is medicine and poison. We need to know how to use it. So digital can be used in so many destructive ways, but digital can also be used in a constructive way. Now, this kind of digital activism, I mean, this kind of solutions may not suffice. But in short term and long term, you have to supplement one with the other. So the medium of digital, and that is where I would like to congratulate the organizers of this lecture series, because they are following this kind of a method whereby they are creating awareness amongst the let us say human population about this particular crisis which we all are going through. So my congratulations to this particular this university and the honorable vice chancellor and all the organizing committee who are actually looking to it. And the third thing is, this short-term solution I'm talking about is equalization through redistribution. Now, please remember, every human society at any given time is not equal. It tries to be equal, but it is not equal, unfortunately. Now, why it is not equal? Then let us go back to that fancy, some people may find it fancy, but it is not fancy, term, which is called as long duhe. For example, when we talk about society, patriarchy, caste, and these are the other issues which actually have created structures of inequality in our society. And these kind of systems, these kind of structures of inequality are so deeply rooted in our, in our, let us say, our thinking, that it doesn't allow those dreams to be realized. If we talk about America, racism is their problem, class is their problem. So this is how we find ourselves mired in these problems. So now there is, so as I was telling you, that every society tries to be equal, but it is almost never equal at given particular point in time. And that is why we need to put pressure on the political machinery, so that it will go for redistribution of the resources which the political machinery, which the state has. And this can be done through, let us say, equalization. So these are the short-term effects which I can think of right now, to deal with this particular crisis. So what I have said, I've talked about the conscience raising, I've talked about digital activism, I've talked about equalization through distribution. These are the things. But then, even if we do these kind of the things, for example, all these great transformations which come in human history, American Revolution, American War of Independence, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, our own, struggle for independence. These are great events. I'm just naming few, but these great events do not live up to their potentials. Now, why do not they live up to their potentials? And here, I'd like to read a very famous passage, and please read this book it's an old book by Franz Fanon. And this is a fantastic book. I am reading a passage from chapter 3rd. The title of this chapter is The Trials and Tribulations of National Consciousness. Now, this book was written in the 1960s, but this book is pretty much, and in this book, he's talking about the African nations, but you would see that this is applicable to everywhere. And, so I'll just read out from this book. He says, Fanon says, and I quote, "Before independence, the leader, as a rule, personified the aspirations of the people, independence, political freedom, and national dignity. But in the aftermath of independence, far from actually embodying the needs of the people, far from establishing himself as the promoter of the actual dignity of the people, which is founded on bread, land, and putting the country back into their sacred hands, the leader will unmask his inner purpose to be the CEO of the company of profiteers composed of a national bourgeoisie, intent only on getting the most out of the situation." My God, this man, wasn't this man a visionary? He was writing this book when he was suffering from leukemia. He wrote this book within a short span of 6 weeks. And the passage which I just read out, it talks about the performative contradiction of that, those great moments I was talking about: American War of Independence, French Revolution, Indian freedom struggle. Almost each and every country in the world has such experience where they think that the golden age is now just the matter of time. It's just round the corner, and we are going to be there. But unfortunately, something happens, and then those dreams are not realized. And what are the reasons for those dreams not not to be realized? I've just talked about those global forces and those effects which are present in each and every society. Now, how do we deal with that? And I know, as I've told you, that after reading Freud and after reading many psychoanalyst thinkers, I've come to the conclusion that the basic human nature, it's dominated by three affects. One is the greed, the other is the fear, and the third one is the violence. If you look at all our human behavior across the world, you would see that these are the three things at work at each and everything. Now, why globalization, which was supposed to be redistributive, has failed? Because greed. The greed has undone the entire thing. That is why we need to take care of these three basic emotions: greed, fear, and violence. Now, I am not a religious, let us say, preacher, because every religion has an answer to these three things. Even religions talk about these things. For example, Hindu Dharma Shastras talk about Shadaripu. Why everything is wrong with the world? Because of kama, krodha, moha, maya, lobh, matsar. And that is exactly what I am talking about. But as I was talking in the previous lecture, that I am a humanities teacher, so my job is to teach in a particular way. My job is to be ethical in my teaching. That is what is expected. And the job of a humanities teacher, and please listen to this carefully, the job of a humanities teacher is to rearrange the desires of the students in uncoercive way. Please understand this phrase, rearranging the desires. As I told you, that human behavior is mostly dominated by these three things: greed, fear, and violence. You can always work with that particular group and reorganize its desires, and reorganizing those desires in uncoercive way. Because you can be a champion of a politically wrong uh, cause, and you may corrupt the minds of young people. But I'm not talking about such teachers. I'm talking about the true teachers. And that is why Karl Marx famously said, who will educate the educator? So we who are in these fields, because the medical community will do its job, the medical community will find out the vaccine, the medical community will find various treatments to this particular problem called as COVID. The political leadership will organize the polity, the economist will manage the economy. But what you and I, people who deal with this kind of teaching, are supposed to do. So what I think is that now the time has come when we take this teaching very, very seriously. We need to realize the potential of what pedagogical practices which we employ in the classroom, and what exactly is the pedagogical teleology of what you and I do. Now you may say that why only humanities? Why only humanities can do this kind of thing? Why sciences cannot do it? Why X subject cannot do it? Why that particular subject cannot do it? Because there is a distinction between the kind of academic transaction which takes place in the humanities classroom and the academic transaction which takes place in other disciplines. And I'll once again give a general description of this particular thing, and the general description is, humanities learning is learning from the singular and the unverifiable, and the learning in the sciences is learning from the general and the verifiable. I'll give a very crude example of it. If I let an object fall from my hand here, it will fall down. This is an event, and what caused this event? This was, let us say, people will say this is because of gravity. If I let this thing drop on Antarctica, the same thing will happen. Now this is a general phenomenon. The phenomenon doesn't change, and it is verifiable. Whatever knowledge you produce, or whatever phenomenon which you try to study, is verifiable. You can verify it scientifically. On the other hand, humanities, remember that famous beginning of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, where he says that all the happy families are happy in the same way, but all the unhappy families are unhappy in the different ways. So why a particular model fails? The model fails because the model is applied as if everything is same. For example, I always talk about this. Look at feminism. The upper class women, their problems are different. The lower caste women, their problems are different. Upper class male, their problems are different. Every identity is fractured by other forces which are at work in the society. And that is why politicians, administrators, all these foreign relations expert, because they are instrumental in their thinking, they tend to forget all these details. On the other hand, humanities, because it tries to learn from the singular. Singular means that particular group, that particular person who is so unique in his or her being, because that's the model of humanities. And that is why humanities teaching, because what is humanities? Philosophy and literature. Philosophy teaches you how to philosophize, and literature teaches you how to imagine. So these are the two things: philosophizing and imagination. And the training of imagination will make us aware about that other, who's there, present out there, whom we just forget in this in this hulabu of all these things. So because humanities tend to the details, the details of all these things which I'm talking about, that is why humanities education is such an important thing. Please remember, you might get jumbled here. I was talking about the long-term solutions and short-term solutions. Long-term, and I'm trying to bring to your notice as to how long-term solutions can be provided by humanities, teaching, humanities learning. So people always ask us, people always say that, why should we study philosophy? Why should we study, let us say, literature and languages and cultural studies? That we should study these because this is the training of imagination. And this training of imagination, the very methodology of conceiving your own object of knowledge and paying attention to its details, that is something which is really, really important. Now let us go back to those two stories I was talking about. The first story, which I said, Primo Levi one, where Primo Levi said that those Nazis were common human beings just like you and me, but badly reared. Those particular people, who who absolutely wreaked havoc on humanity. They believed in the ideology of Nazism, racial superiority, and that kind of nonsense. They did not subject it to critical analysis, and that is why they became the instruments of violence. And please remember here, I'd like to talk about a very interesting book by Donald Goldhagen here, that famous American author who wrote that wonderful book on, on Germany under Hitler. The title of that book is Hitler's Willing Executioners. And in that book, he says that, yes, Hitler was bad. He did bad things, but Hitler did not use up political power. I mean, he was properly elected. He got elected into the office. And thereby I come to my second story, when Hannah Arendt said that evil is common. The evil may reside in you, the evil may reside in me. And this evil differs from person to person. It's very common. You don't, a person, in order to become a Hitler, doesn't need to be fanged person from whom the blood is dipping, who's red in tooth and claw, as Tennyson famously said. You can just be an ordinary human being, but guided by this kind of wrong ideologies. Now let us go back to that previous question which I was raising. Despite of all these great promises, despite of all these great moments, American War of Independence, French Revolution, Indian freedom struggle, and so many other struggles, and so many movements of emancipation, why these movements do not live up to it? Because the ideals fall in the hands of people who are already compromised on those principles. And that is why these models remain models. They do not realize their potential. They do not transform the world as they were supposed to do. That is the reason as to why this kind of education is such an important thing, because this education plays a very important role, and this education actually gives importance to the details which are usually forgotten in so many things. So that's why the role of humanities is such an important thing. And there's one more thing which I would like to say, and then we'll wind up. And that is, why humanities are important. because humanities study model, philosophy, history, social sciences, literature, is based on certain, it's based on certain epistemological charges, and certain, there is a particular way we produce knowledge. What is the model of humanities? The model of humanities is, it's a very interesting thing. For example, when somebody asked me, define what happens in a classroom. So I said that, the classroom transaction should actually take place on 4 different levels. First is information, the second is knowledge, the third is wisdom, and the fourth one is action. Now, for example, whatever information, first of all, it is the level of information. You just get information about a particular thing. If I have to give an example, I would say the Rohingya issue. You read, you discuss it in the classroom, you read an article about it, and then this is how the information comes to you. Now, what happens is, if your imagination is trained in a particular way, then naturally what will happen is that your imagination will transform that object of knowledge into knowledge, so from information to knowledge. And then from this knowledge, if you analyze this knowledge, for example, what is wrong with the Rohingyas and why they find themselves in such terrible position because of nationalism and racism and so many issues, that is your wisdom. And then once you are wise enough, then you will be able to act in a proper way. So this is information, knowledge, wisdom, action. And the basic trajectory in the field of humanities is study, know. We study because we want to know, and from knowing we move on to the next stage, that is called as learning. And from then learning, we hear the voices of the other, and then from after hearing that, the next thing is action. So please remember, we all are perfectly perfectly nice people who believe in the principle of justice and equality and everything, but when it comes to practice, it falls. We always fall short of those ideals. So to my mind, humanities education actually bridges that gap between theory and praxis. Now, theory means, yes, we believe in political freedom, we believe in independence, we believe in dignity of human life, we believe in justice for everybody. But when it comes to practice, we do not practice it. So what is that thing which will inhabit this gap? And to my mind, that gap is inhabited by humanities. Disciplines like philosophy, disciplines like literature, discipline like history and social sciences, because they make you aware about these pitfalls which do not allow those high ideals to realize their potential. That's the usual map. That's the epistemological map, I should say. And that is why humanities is such an important discipline. Now, the challenges which are put forward by this COVID-19 crisis, the kind of world which we are going to inherit or inhabit after this is going to be a very problematic world. As I've told you, this is the first crisis to my mind. I mean, my future audience will correct me if I am wrong, that this is the first crisis in the history of humanity where we haven't come across a leadership which has risen to the occasion. Otherwise, in the previous tragedies and in the previous, let us say, crises like these, we always had some kind of leadership, which tried to solve the problem for the entire human race. Now, if you look at the world, see, I mean, I was talking about these global institutions, and I made a point that there should have been a global effort for finding out a vaccine. Why there is no global effort? There is a Israeli vaccine, there is an American vaccine, there is a Chinese vaccine, there is a, let us say, an Italian vaccine, there's an Indian vaccine, but where is the human vaccine? Where is the vaccine for the humanity? That's the problem. So naturally, we are a part of a world which is divided by so many things, and which is divided by so many forces. And if at all we want to, please remember that famous sentence from Hegel. Hegel says that all great things in the history happen twice. First time tragedy, second time farce. So this is tragedy which we are facing. If we do not learn our lessons, and if we do not really pay attention to the quick, short-term solutions and the long-term solutions, we will be able to create the kind of, it will be mere repetition of what we are just witnessing here. Today it is COVID-19. Tomorrow it might be some other crisis, and there won't be any global leadership. There won't be any global, let us say, institution to take care of, the entire human thing. So these are the lessons which we will have to learn. And to my mind, the best way to to create a just world would be the world where we will be able to create the will for social justice. Please remember, democracy is not only democracy is not about justified self-interest. What you and I am going to get out of it. It is about the will of social justice. As long as that will for social justice is not created in the society, the Dr. Ambedkars of the world will keep saying that democracy will not survive in case of, in our case, he said India. In other cases, we can say it will not survive, in all these, in all these, let us say, parts of the world. And that is why, if the humanity has to survive this crisis, the crisis should be recognized, its ramifications should be understood, and then we will have to develop policies for the short-term solutions and for the long-term solutions. And only, we take into, only when one supplements the other, we will be able to come up with a better lesson and a better world. That is what I wanted to say. And which thing can do it? Changing the mindset. And whose role is it to change the mindset? I think it is the educator's role. The educator, as Gramsci famously said, was a permanent persuader. We always keep pursuing people for better things. That is what we can do in our classrooms. We'll be able to create a future generation which will kill the mother of social injustice, and which can create the mother of social injustice in each and every generation. I'm reminded of that incident from Ramayana, the Ahiravan Mahiravan. You have to keep killing them, you have to keep killing those Ravans again and again. So this mother of injustice needs to be killed in each and every generation, and that can only be killed by a trained mindset, by a mindset which is, whose imagination is trained to take into account the voice of the other, and only humanities education can do that. So we will need our economist, our foreign, the international relations expert. We will need our political leadership. We'll need our medical community to find out the short-term solutions for overcoming this particular problem. But we will need our humanities teacher, and we will need our, the young minds, the trained young minds, to create a better world. With this, do you think that we'll be able to create completely just world? I think that is an impossible dream. But we all have to keep doing this again and again. It's like that famous example. Medical science was developed in order to make us almost immortal. Have we become immortals? No. But that doesn't mean that you are going to give up medical science. So in the words of Gramsci, which he borrowed actually from Romarola, he said that we have to act with activism of we have to act with the pessimism of the intellect and the activism of the will. Pessimism of the intellect, because we know we won't be able to create a properly just world, because these structures of injustice, they keep changing their spots, just like that leopard. But we will have to create generations and generations and generations of trained mind, so that they keep killing this mother of injustice again and again. Okay, so that is the activism of the will. So that is why I think that this particular pandemic and has created that kind of space for us, whereby we'll be able to work towards creation of the world which is equitable, which will be just, with pessimism of the intellect and activism of the will. Thank you so much.
So great words of wisdom from Dr. Nitin Patil, Professor Nitin Patil. He has delivered wonderful talk and suggested certain solutions uh, like consciousness raising, digital activism, equalization through redistribution, and this can go a long way in improving our condition. He has also pointed out a very important sentence on the role of humanities, where he tells us that humanities moves from single to unverifiable, unverifiable, and arts is very much about training of imagination. Humanities bridges the gap between what is and what should be. Those were the really great words. And if at all we have to improve our condition, realize or come approach, go near to our aspirations, to our desired ideals, we will have to take into account the role and importance of humanities and arts. So on behalf of the virtual C4 channel, I thank Professor Nitin Patil for accepting our invitation and delivering such wonderful talks, scholarly talks. I'm also thankful to our technical team, expert, Mr. Gaurav Ingre, and other members of the VC4 channel committee for their immense help and cooperation. Last but not the least, I extend my gratitude to all our audience for the keen participation and involvement. Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much.